Our speaker today is Bob Toal from Maryland. He's a longtime collector and friend, and it's just wonderful what he's been able to put together on this question of the origins of American postcards from 1848 to 1898. He's really pushed it back, but you're going to see why and to see some of these real rarities that he's been able to collect and to work with. It's the first 50 years of postcard collecting. I don't think I've hardly ever seen any of these before, but let's see what you remember or may have seen, or we may discover next tomorrow or the next week. We'll see. But welcome, Bob, and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for being here, everyone. I want to talk today about the origins of postcards, but just for a little aside, for postcard history on the net, I had the privilege of writing the very first article for that magazine, and the title was "The Mansfield Bar." It was about Jane Mansfield and her tragic death, and the result was the bar that's on the back of trucks. So. That was a very fun article to write. But on this particular program, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the card itself and how it went through permutations over the years after it was born. This first card was part of a set of 12 cards issued in 1896 from Harvard, Boston, and surrounding areas. And this particular card was overprinted by the J.F. Olson Company, and he's trying to tell his customers what a souvenir card is all about and what you use it for. So it says, I'm a sample souvenir card. There are 12 kinds of me, 4 of which are Harvard cards. I could do you a clever service as a means of invitation for class, day, or commencement, as a souvenir for visiting friends or correspondence. So we know what cards are for now, but in those days, when you were a publisher and you had to sell your cards, you had to tell the public, give them a reason why to buy them. The very first U.S. postcard was in 1848, and it was a Franklin Insurance Company insurance reminder card that the expiration of the policy date was at hand. And only one copy exists, but it's 1848. The next set of cards was the Fire Association of Philadelphia, of which 9 are known. And this particular one was 1865. So these are private commercial business cards that began the trend in the United States. And this particular card has an illustration. So it is the very first private postcard with an illustration on it. 3 other cards were produced in 1849 through 1869, and these are down here. And it should be remembered that 3 of these cards were actually designed to be postcards. They had an address line and a space for the stamp, whereas these other 2 were just mailed cards that could be put in a envelope and mailed and so forth. So the card was flipped over, the address was written on the back. To get the ball rolling, what happened in the United States was in November of 1870, the Postmaster General said, we're going to make postal cards and sell them at a reduced rate of postage. So currently people were paying 3 cents for a letter. They could buy a postal card for 1 cent and write a letter on that, although it'd be very short. So in June of 1872, the postal card law was passed, and the printed matter rate was lowered to 1 cent per 2 ounce, and I'll get into that. What happened was there were delays in the government's quest to produce these cards, and it took 2.5 years to get them out. And here's an example of the first government card. And on the back is an illustration of the Mount Washington Summit House. And some people claim this card is the very first view card in the United States because it's a view of the train going up the cog railroad going up the mountainside. I think it's a card advertising the Washington Summit House as itself, but it could be either one. But it's a quite rare card. So in 1871 to 1873, during the time when the government's cards were on hold because of technical issues, the private sector got antsy and decided to print their own cards. And they figured they could just print a card and it would be handled in the mail just like the government cards were proposed. 1 cent for a message, 1 cent for a written advertisement or a printed advertisement. One of the earliest cards was the Condon card in 1871, and it was sold to for correspondence, and there was a way of purchasing the advertising medium on the back. At the same year, the American Postcard Company came out with a card in 1871. There's only 4 copies of these cards. There were several copies of these floating around. They also came out with the postal letter envelope. And then in 1872, Lippmann came out with his idea of a card. And his idea was to sell these cards to customers to use them on their own businesses, primarily advertising rates. So when the government cards were on hold and these private cards came out, they were pushing them for correspondence, and the federal government jumped on them and said, no, that's not going to happen. If you want to pay 1 cent, it's going to be for a written advertisement, for a printed advertisement. But if you want a letter written on the back of it, you're going to have to pay letter rate. So that kind of set the tone for the future. So what was happening in that time, it cost 3 cents to mail a letter. And if you had a private card and you wrote on the back in letter format, it cost 3 cents also. So any correspondence was 3 cents. If you mailed an advertisement in an unsealed envelope and it was all printed, there was no communication, it was 1 cent. Same thing if you had a private postcard that was printed and had illustrations on it, it was 1 cent. But the proposed government card had a dual nature. For 1 cent, you could either have a printed advertisement or a written advertisement. So the private cards wanted this rate. They wanted to benefit from both. So they started the trek of trying to get Congress to approve this, but it took 25 years for them to get that passed. Congress made a couple of attempts in 1888 and 1893 to lower the rate, but it didn't happen. But it was achieved in 1898. Once the issue was settled that you couldn't use the cards for correspondence unless you paid letter rate, but you could pay 1 cent for printed letter rate, 18 businesses came out with their own personal private cards prior to the government card. And these cards had the title postal card of the company. Here's Herrick's postal card, Kendall's picture balsam card, so forth. So these were printed matter cards and were mailed for 1 cent. This particular card was mailed at 2 cents prior to the rate coming down. So it's in a class by itself. So these are quite early cards, and they were setting the trend. They were all business type cards or commercial cards. In 1873 to 79, the dust was settling, and then a lot of the businesses started to use government cards, but some used private cards, and they had the ability to make them larger. They could make them more attractive by printing them because they had coating on the front that enhanced the printing. So a lot of the private people, some of them started using private cards, but it was certainly more expensive to do so. And here's an example of Cornwell's card. The general public started mailing cards from other sources, and cabinet cards were a big thing in those days from 1866 to 1914, and some people decided to mail them, and they mailed them at printed matter rate. That is to say, they wrote the address, but there was no other form of correspondence on the card. It was simply a picture of a card that had printing on it, and it was mailed. So they could mail it at a cheaper rate. This particular one was 2 cents. So it was prior to the change in rates to 1 cent. And this one was afterward. So the public started understanding that this is kind of neat. Let's mail these things to my friends. Well, in 1876, the Centennial Exposition occurred, and trade cards started to hit the marketplace by the thousands, and people caught on. These were given away at the fair. Some were actually sold, but most of them were just blank cards on the back, and they had an advertisement on the other side. Some people decided to mail these cards. Even though they are trade cards, there's no address lines and there's no stamp box. So they just simply wrote the address wherever they could, put the stamp in a clear spot wherever they could. At the fair also, trade cards of the fair buildings were made and sold in sets in envelopes that could be mailed. So a set of 8 cards could be put in this envelope or this envelope, and they actually were bought in these envelopes and sold. So this is an early example, 1876, of trade cards from a fair being available to be mailed. I'm not aware of any actual mailed ones with a cancel stamp. They might be out there, but I'm not aware of them. Well, along the lines of souvenirs for tourists, all that was available in those days was the so-called Souvenir View album. And these came available during the fair and also into the 1890s. And they were a cardboard case with an accordion pleated set of images that were high quality printing. And most of them were for expositions, American cities, or scenery. Some of them had a mailing envelope. And you can see this one here has a library rate postage on it and address lines. And this particular one of Nantucket fits inside there. So again, there was this trend toward, once you have a trade card or some other sort of souvenir card for a tourist, can we share this information with other people through the mails? Well, in 1880, the graphic company of New York, C.M. Goodsell was one of the publishers, came out with an idea where he would capitalize on trade cards that were out there. People were collecting trade cards and putting them in albums. So he thought he would actually print up a set of 20 color postcards in 4 different sizes for printed matter use or collector cards. So in other words, he printed out these stock cards and sold them by the pack to a company, say a stationery store, would buy these cards, print their ads on the back and address them and pay 1 cent printed matter to their customers to notify them of sales that are going on. He also pushed the fact that these are collector cards. In other words, there's 20 in the set, these are well done, and they were artist signed. Every card in this set has an artist's signature on it. And it came in 4 different sizes and 4 different sets. Well, what happened to him was he ran into a snafu with the Postal Service. The Postal Service decided that no longer were private cards mailable at the printed matter rate. In other words, you couldn't mail them for 1 cent anymore. You had to pay 3 cents. So here's Goodsell, who prints up all these cards by the thousands, trying to sell them to people to use at 1 cent, where they can buy the card and mail them for 1 cent. Now, the Postal Service is saying it's going to cost 3 cents. So the service came out with that ruling July 13th, and it was to go into effect January 1, 1881. So all of a sudden, Goodsell, the sales were poor. Nobody would buy them, at least not for printed matter use. So here's the typical card of a smaller D-size card. It has a stamp box and an address panel. And of course, Goodsell wanted people to, this particular one has a printed advertisement on the back. He wanted people to buy cards to use for this. Some people bought the cards and used them for a message. This particular card has a written message on the back, and it paid 3 cents. And for these cards, only 8 are known used. As a result of that post office decision, many of the cards ended up being used as trade cards. In other words, they were simply printed in the stamp box in the address panel, an advertisement. Rather than on the back of the card, they printed it on the colorful front. Goodsell also converted some to New Year's cards. And this particular one is a graphics card advertising the New Year's cards. So Goodsell, his plan was thwarted where he had to bounce back and end up doing these. Now, these things end up in trade card albums. So if you have trade card collectors out there, keep an eye out for these things. They're rare and quite valuable. So Goodsell, in November of 1880, in his paper, the graphic company decided to advertise his New Year's cards. And this is an example of an 1881 New Year's card that he sold. And it was just for greetings. You could either mail them or give them to people. Just to set the record straight for get the information out there, I've put together over the years pictures of the 20 cards in his set. And these are the D-size cards, which are the regular size postcards. You can see there's 5 different ones in this set. These are a little bit bigger. These are like continental size cards. There are 5 in that set. And there are 4 known in the larger size, 7 inches long. There's 1 missing, which I don't know what it looks like. And there's 2 missing in the A size. These things are big, 5 1/4 by 7 3/4. And they have an address panel, but no real stamp box. And there's only 3 here. So there's 2 missing. So there's 3 missing in this set. So if any of y'all out there know of these, let me know, please, because I'm trying to put the whole set together historically. That went by the wayside. And then in 1882, John Harris decided to double down on that concept by making historical cards from Pennsylvania, the Wyoming Indian Massacre, and the William Penn's Treaty. And he put these on the back of a government card. And here's the one for the William Penn Treaty and then the massacre card. And he advertised these 25 for 50 cents or 100 for $1.50. And they're very rare. I've only seen maybe 2 or 3 copies of each one ever, which suggests that they didn't sell very well at all, that it was just simply a labor of love that he went through. Well, in 1884 and 85, the Crump Label Company of Montclair, New Jersey, they were labels. They would make food labels, and they made their fortune making food labels. But for 2 years, he decided to make trade cards and of a calendar format, and he mailed them monthly to his customers, advertising his label business. And they usually show a 1-cent stamp on the back, their written address, and there's no written material on the front, just printed matter. So he would mail these for 1 cent. There were several of them out there. In 1885, Crump also supplied cards to other companies. More specifically, the Munson Acorn Collars and Cuff Company bought cards from Crump, and used an acorn as a motif on his calendar. I think about 7 or 8 different calendar dates are known, or month dates are known. I don't think the whole year is known. Other people also used his trade cards and mailed them for their own reasons. So you would find the same trade card, say this man in a hammock, and on it has William Gunnison and Son. You could find the same trade card with Crump Company on it or some other company name on it, and it may or may not be mailed. So these were trade cards, but they were calculated to be mailed at a periodic time in a methodical way. So they really set the precedent for direct mail marketing in this era. And again, these cards may end up in trade card collections, and maybe even pasted down in a trade card album, and you have to soak them off or look on the other side to find out if there's a stamp on it. Well, in the 1880s, during the rest of the decade, trade card or postcards started to become more prolific and more attractive. Here's a color printing on the back of this Landdress seed card, and this is it's not rare, but it's certainly scarce. I've seen maybe 6 copies of it, but this is 1887, and then John's asbestos card came out, and it has address lines, and it has a printed stamp box, which is on the back. You can see it right there. And the way John's worked his cards was he printed up the entire card, but this blank space for sale by was empty, and the business who was selling his products would take his cards and put their name in there. And I have identified at least 9 different vendors with their different names in there. Only 2 of these cards are known mailed. The rest of them are unmailed. And quite frankly, a lot of them are seen with just the color photo, color picture cut off. So this part of the card was cut off, and this card was saved by trade card collectors. So they mutilated a postcard. So these are very early postcards. Well, these cards were non-coded, so they were less expensive to produce theoretically, even though this is a very elaborate printing. John Alden was a discount publisher, and he made 4 or 5 different varieties of this particular card, and this is an 1880s card. This spectacular card by Beatty, I've got one of these that's a bifold, and it kind of comes up here, and then there's the other half down the bottom. So he's advertising Daniel F. Beatty's postal card, and he's advertising pianos and organs. Quite prolific advertiser, and he was I think a public official at where he was in Washington, New Jersey. But very attractive card, very difficult to find. Private people got into the act also. This particular one by Gilkson was a deaf-mute stamp dealer. And this particular example was mailed at the then current letter rate, 2 cents. And he says, on the 17th of February, I had issued 981 local postal cards. This is one of them, and the date is under the stamp. I am the only deaf-mute stamp dealer in America. I've seen 2 copies of this card. There's got to be more left out there, but anyway, seen 2 copies, and it's conducting his stamp business, local postal card. And the 1890s became the key decade for postcards like we collect today. Printed matter advertising certainly was still on the roll, but other areas for private cards, such as fraternal order assessments or municipal league membership cards. And this particular card down the bottom right, since it had writing on the back, just a few words, it was in the form of a correspondence, therefore it was due letter rate, which was 2 cents. And so what happened was the Postal Service members who going through these cards, canceling them, had to look carefully to see if there was any violation of the current code. And they would have to pull that card out, hit it with a postage due stamp, and then send it on. And it would really slow down movement of the thousands of cards that were on their table to process, thousands of envelopes, cards mixed in. So it was quite challenging to maintain your speed. Van Cott, in 1892, which was the postmaster of New York, made the decision that the words private postal card or postal card were no longer legal on private cards. He claimed that the word postal card was solely belonged to the U.S. government. So it says, hereafter, the Post Office Department will not forward any private postal cards. That is, cards bearing a 1 cent stamp and the words postal card or blanks special postal card. The department objects to the word postal card on such cards. Though if the word be left off, the card will be mailable if properly stamped with a 1 cent stamp. So this is a correspondence card. So there was a 2 cent stamp because there was a letter on it. But if he tried to mail this 1 cent with printed matter, it would not have gone because it had the words postal on it. But again, the government put their foot down in 1892. But you will see the words postal card on private cards after that, and they have gone through the mails at 1 cent. 1891 was the beginning of the U.S.-German sea post. And tourists started becoming acquainted with German postcards, particularly American tourists. And so what the German Sea Post did was the Postal Service decided to put a postal crew of 3 people on the ship, going from east to west, or west to east, east to west, to process the several hundred bags of mail that were on the ship. So they would actually sort the mail, put them in proper bags so that when the ship arrived at port, the bags were ready to be move on to the train, and it sped up the delivery of the mail. Travelers on board, when they either bought these cards or had one given in their berth, could buy stamps from the nation that they belong to, from the counter on the ship. And this particular one is a 5-cent US stamp mail. So US stamps were used on the eastbound voyage. German stamps were used on the westbound voyage. And hundreds of these things are out there, but the earliest dated ones are of 1890s, very early 1890s. So this set the stage for tourists and view cards as we would normally think. In 1891 or sometime late 1890, the Livermore Night Company of Providence, Rhode Island, made novelty cards for direct mail advertising. So they capitalized on Crump's method of direct mail advertising, except they kicked it up a notch or two, and they made very attractive cards. So their tact was to go to a company and they would say, what are you selling? What is your customer base like? We can come up with a design of a card that we think would attract your viewers to actually read the mail and respond to it. And so there's over 400 examples of different cards made by Livermore Night from 1891 through 1919. And these are several of them from the 19th century. And you can see they're quite colorful and quite attractive, but they're called Livermore Night. Very, very interesting cards in my opinion. So the real true tourist card or view card started to come into play in the US in 1893 early on. And this card is one of a set of 5, kind of a drab card, but it is one of a set of 5 published by Matthews and Northrop. And the earliest known use is January 27th, 1893. This card example is August 7th. And it was printed on the back of a government postal. So people could mail it for 1 cent. And it was in the form of a communication because they wrote a date in there. And if this was a private card, it would have cost 2 cents to mail that because it was a communication. But these cards are out there and they look very drab, but historically they're quite significant in my opinion. Chisholm deserves credit for being maybe one of the earlier card producers or one of the earliest card producers. So this particular card was produced on a Grant Postal, which are a little bit larger than average cards. And he coated them with a kaolin-like coating and printed them with high quality printing techniques. And this particular card is quite attractive in my opinion. But if you look at it, it's like a Goose House type format, and it has the Glen House in the lower right. Now, the key thing here is that the Glen House opened for the season in June of 1893, but it burned in July of 1893. So this card is an 1893 card, even though it's not mailed and there's no date on it. So based upon that historical fact, we know this is an 1893 card. Also, because it was meant to be available for the summer season of 1893, it was probably in the works in the spring or even right in the winter of 1893. So it is an early card. An 1894 card exists where it looks exactly the same, greetings from the White Mountains, and in the right-hand corner, there's the Fabian House instead of the Glen House. So this is a very early, and if not one of the earliest view cards that are out there. And it's quite attractive too. Also on the grant cards, which were uncoded, many different views of Niagara Falls were made. And these, the earliest one, I think, is in July of 1893. And the summit of Pikes Peak cards were out there. And I think this one, July 1893 was the early example. Tourist cards were available. And what happened was in the newspapers in 1891, the newspapers started to talk about tourist cards and view cards in Europe. And so for several years, the public was being introduced to the view cards through the newspaper. And publishers started to follow up on it. The only problem is publishers' names are not on these cards, although there is a name on this card and it's readable on there. These have an extra cent added because they were mailed to Europe, Austria. Or if it was local, it would be 1 cent, but if it was going overseas, it's 2 cents. In 1893 and 94, A.S. Burbank, who owned a souvenir shop in Plymouth, Massachusetts, he published 3 postcards commemorating the Pilgrims and advertising Pilgrim souvenirs. So these are the 3 cards he produced. The first ones came out on the oversized grant card. The second, all 3 images came out on the follow-up Jefferson card of 1894. So these cards are probably advertising his business and or souvenirs, but in some respects, someone could say that they might be souvenir cards from visiting the Plymouth, Massachusetts also. This is a very attractive card in my opinion, and it's of Washington, D.C. And it's a private card, not printed on a government back. It's dated May 21st, 1893. It was mailed with a 2-cent stamp, but it went overseas. So an overseas private card was 5 cents. So it was tax postage due of 3 cents. But there's a letter written on the back of this particular card. In and around the Columbian Exposition, which we're all told that that's when the souvenir card craze started. Actually, it started around January of 1893 and earlier. And so these cards are out there. So the Columbian Exposition ran for about 6 months. Main cards at the fair were printed on the Grant Postal card. It was a larger card, so you had a bigger printing surface and it made more attractive cards. Goldsmith cards were coded, and he used color printing, and they were high quality. Kohler's cards were on uncoated cardstock, and they were black and white images. So these cards exist out there in several different sets, this particular one for sure. Private companies also printed their own cards for the fair, and their postage rates were 2 cents local, 5 cents foreign, versus 1 cent local, 2 cents foreign. But here's the kicker. The grant card was an oversized card and was against the rules of the Universal Postal Union, which had a maximum limit of card size smaller than the grant card. So theoretically, the grant card was breaking the law of the Postal Union, and it should have paid 5 cents to mail rather than 2. And I'll get into the follow-up of that in a little bit. Here's an example of an attractive trifold card, which was mailed at printed matter rate, advertising a lithographer, and it has a 1 cent Columbian stamp on it. When the Columbian Exposition was winding down, sometime actually in the mid part in August, somebody from California decided, hey, wouldn't it be neat if we had this exposition on the West Coast? And he was a mover and a shaker, and he was able to get the idea going and get backers. And he actually got a large number of the exhibitors at the Columbian Exposition to agree to come to the California Fair. And he was planning to have that start in January of 1894. Since the large size grant card was running into a snafu overseas, after the Columbian Exposition closed, postal services decided instead of looking the other way, they were going to charge the right rate on the card, which was 5 cents since it was oversized. Because of the confusion that existed, the new Postmaster General decided to stop the sale of the grant card January 1st. So no longer would the grant card be available. So that put the planners of the California Midwinter Exposition in a tizzy somewhat, in that they wanted their fare cards to be on larger size cards. The proposed follow-up card was a Jefferson card right at this side, which is more of a normal size card. Because of that, they decided to put their cards on private card stock. So the California Midwinter Exposition cards are all on private card stock, and they all have stamp to pay the postage. 3 different sets exist, but in terms of usage of these cards, a very important phenomenon occurred that would set the stage for postcard collectors hereafter. And that is, they were mailing, this one person, George's Carry-On, was a stamp dealer. He decided to mail postcards at the printed matter rate. This was locally, and he also mailed them overseas for 1 cent. So in other words, he would purchase a blank card, not write anything on it. He would address it and mail it for 1 cent, and it would go overseas, it would go locally for printed matter rate. Theoretically, he should have put printed matter rate up there, but he didn't. But it got through, and I think my tally is about 44 of these cards exist at the 1 cent printed matter rate. And it's a cheaper way when the postcard craze hit America for immigrants to mail back home pictures of their city they lived in for 1 cent rather than 5 cents. So it was a very convenient method. So George's Carry-On was the first to start that. Here's a midwinter card used at letter rate, and it was mailed to Germany at 2 cents. And of course, it was a private card, should have been 5 cents. So it was tax postage due. So people had trouble figuring out what the rates were. And that's why the government cards were so useful, because it was a no-brainer. You would buy the card, it was a government card, you added a penny if you wanted to mail overseas, you mailed it as is if you want to mail it at home. If you bought a private card and you mixed it up with a government card, you didn't know the rate. This particular card had the rate printed on there as a reminder to the person buying them. So that was very helpful. So here's where the snafu really, really hit. In 1895, the Cotton States International Exposition was held in Atlanta, and they had a set of 14 postcards, very, very pretty, high-quality cards that were larger than regular-sized cards, and they were to be used with a postage stamp. But instead of putting the postage rate in the stamp box, they simply put the words postage stamp here. Well, people didn't know what the rates were. They didn't have enough experience with private cards in order to know what to put on there. Here's an example of a card mailed with 2 cents overseas to Austria. And of course, it should have been 5 cents, so it was tax postage due. What happened at the fair early on was that thousands of these cards were underpaid and sent to the dead letter office. And as a result, these cards are quite scarce. Here's a reprint from the Atlanta Constitution, which is a newspaper, one day after the fair opened. And it says, several days ago, just after opening, about 10,000 cards found their way into the post office. The cards carried only a 1 cent stamp, and it was the reason they were not allowed to continue to their destination. The entire lot will be sent to the dead letter office in a few days. So here we have the post office. There's no return address on these things. They're simply addressed to the recipient, and they were not allowed to forward them because they didn't have the proper postage, and there were thousands of them. So they simply sent them to the dead letter office. And so that was a consequence of not planning when they printed up the stamp box. In 1895, a folded card for tourists was available through machines in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And under the stamp, it does say use a 2 stamp here, 2 cent stamp here. So it was the current letter rate, and it was designed for a folded card and a correspondence, a letter of some sort. So this particular card is a bifold card that has an image of the Summit House Hotel and ready for a message, and it had a tab on it so that it would be closed. There is the Lizzie Borden Monument card available and other cards. So there's probably 5 or 6 different styles of these cards that were made in the early 1890s. 1895 is one of the earliest. In November of 1895, a local event in California called the Goethe Schiller Fest, which was a music festival, produced their own cards. And they were private cards again. Address lines, stamp box. So it's a traditional postcard. And it was mailed locally for 2 cents. And overseas, it would have been 5 cents. So you can see that they used poor quality paper as it has yellowed because of the acid content over the years. These cards, I think I've seen 2 or 3 of these cards in my travels. In 1896, Atlantic City came out with a tourist card. And the story on this is kind of interesting because the publisher was a publisher of a local newspaper, Carl Volcker. He printed the cards based on an idea brought home from Germany by his wife. So Germany was using private cards right and left for tourists of all sorts, and she liked the cards and got the idea and brought it back to her husband, who followed up on it and made private cards and sold them in New Jersey. And there are 3 different varieties of this card present. The box will vary in view. This side will be the same, but the box will have 3 different views of this pavilion in it. And this was mailed on a government card, and it was overpaid when it was mailed overseas. You could have gotten by with an extra 1 cent stamp. So these are 1896 Atlantic City cards. So now we're back to the American Souvenir Card Company with their 12 cards in their set. And the cards were first published in 1896. In March, they started advertising these things, and there were 12 cards in the set. The cards did so well that they sold them as is on the front, no changes in the design, for 15 years. And you can find these cards postmarked during that period of time. Because the postal laws changed over time, the backs were printed differently. There's about 12 different back printings available on these cards. And notice how this card does not say postcard, does not say private mailing card, it does not say souvenir card. It's blank. And that was okay during the period of pioneer cards, which were before the 1 cent private mailing cards. But when private mailing cards came out, you had to have terminology up there. So some of these cards exist with the term private mailing card printed on them. So again, there are 12 cards of this set, very, very attractive set, and I recommend people keeping their eye out for them. They're out there, and they're not that expensive, but keep an eye out for the early ones. March 1896 was one of the earliest. This particular one is December. Well, Congress got involved at the Postmaster General's urging. The Postmaster Wilson made an address to Congress in 1895 to lower the private postcard rate to 1 cent. And his rationale was it would relieve the post office department from the expense of printing, sorting, and handling government postal cards. So the government, when you bought a government card, you paid 1 cent for the card and the indicia, which was the postage rate. So for 1 cent, you got the whole kit and caboodle. His rationale was if somebody buys a private card, they still have to use a 1 cent stamp. So our revenue is the same. We don't lose revenue. So his idea was to save money with printing, storing, and so forth, the government cards. And this was in 1895 when he suggested this. It took Congress a while to follow up on that, but in December of 1896, Loud, who was chairman of the Post Office Committee, submitted a bill to the House to allow private mailing cards at the postage rate of 1 cent apiece. And it passed the House, but it did not pass the Senate. And what happened was the newspapers jumped the gun, and they thought that the bill had passed both houses and the Private Mailing Card Act was passed. And so newspaper articles from spring through early July said private mailing cards will be in order after today. July 1st, you can start. And this is 1897. So they told everybody that July 1, 1897 will cost 1 cent to mail a message or an advertisement. As a result of that, 30 publishers came out of the woodwork and started publishing postcards. 16 did it on government postals and 14 on private backs. So that was the impetus that started the floodgates and the water flowing through. But the Postal Service corrected the newspaper's false reports saying that, nope, it did not pass. You're still going to have to pay the different rates. So basically, the Postal Service said, no such law. The Private Mailing Card Act did not pass. And this was July 7th, 1897. So we're back to square one. If you had a card printed on a government card, you could mail it for 1 cent. Government card 1 cent, overseas 2 cents. If you had a private card, it cost 2 cents local, 5 cents foreign. So those publishers that decided to publish on the government card got through. Now the publishers on private cards, on government cards, had a risk because they would buy these cards in sheets. But if they were printing them and something happened with the printing, then they would lose the money invested into the card itself. So if they bought a sheet of 32, they would lose 32 cents. So they would have to be very cautious and careful in their printing. Whereas with a private card, you know, it was just paper waste and cardstock. So that was 1897. No such law. They went back to the drawing board, and in May 19th, Loud and his committee submitted a bill, and the postal laws were amended for private mailing cards. It was passed by both houses on May 19th and took effect July 1st. So on this date, July 1st, postcards and postal cards were equal relative to their cost for mailing, 1 cent. You could write a message on it for 1 cent. You could have a printed advertisement for 1 cent. They were equal, but there's a problem that became evident later on. And that is, on a U.S. postal card, there's this little term that says, this side is for the address only. And private mailing cards had to have that on there. This side is exclusively for the address. So even though they became equal in terms of how much it costs to mail, there was a problem with this exclusively for the address, because now the note had to be written on the front of the card, which caused problems with the printing on the face. So sometimes the messages would mess up the image. So even though they gained equal status for the 1 cent rate, they realized that they had another step to go, and that is they needed to lobby for the divided back card, which came about in 1907. So here it's said exclusively for the address, whereas over here you could put a stamp, the address, and of course the message, 1907. So in conclusion, in essence, in the US, there were 5 types of private cards by 1898. We've seen the commercial cards, and they started in 1871, really, and on. There were shipped tourist cards on the German seapost vessels, 1891, and the US vessels also after that. Then there were exposition cards, Columbian Expo, California Midwinter, Cotton States, and Trans-Mississippi. Columbian Expo had the government cards, Trans-Miss had government cards, these two had private cards. Then there were view cards for tourists. beginning in 1892 about, and then prospered after that. White Mountains, New Hampshire, Niagara Falls, New York, and Pikes Peak, Colorado. And then the view cards that we all go for, and that is view cards for collectors, 1897 and on. So that's the end of the story, and these are just examples of two large, oversized cards on ships, and they're quite colorful. These are the only two different varieties that I've seen. There we have it.
Okay, thank you, Bob. My goodness, it's just so much material and postcards that we've never seen, or I haven't. Maybe some.
Neither have I until you run into them.
Well, they're just wonderful. And we're just honored to have you here. I mean, you're the man with all the answers with all of this first 50 years. It's just incredible. Really is. Um, Rayhan will
Yes, I'm here.
unmute you and please, are there any comments or questions?
Well, yeah, we have 3 or 4 good comments. Kate commented on the fact that the cards that were not mailable went to the dead letter office. Is there still such a thing, Bob, as a dead letter office?
You know, I think so, but I can't say for sure. There has to be, if you can't read the address, and the so-called Nixie clerks who spend their time specializing in that, they can't read the address, they got to send them somewhere. So that if they go to the dead letter office, then they get sold as scrap paper afterward. So I think so, but I got to check on that.
Well, maybe we could hope that they at least recycle them.
Yeah, I think they do sell it as scrap paper. Yeah, they do.
Okay. We also had a couple of comments about the cabinet cards being mailed.
Yes.
That's quite interesting. How popular was that?
They're rare to find them mailed. Obviously, cabinet cards are all over the place, and every time I go to a show, I look for cabinet cards that seem to be the poor views, figuring maybe I can score by finding one mailed. And
Okay.
I picked one up at the York show 2 years ago. It was a nice card. Cost me $75, but it was worth it. It was a nice card.
Okay. All right. Somebody else also made a comment about the cancels on that one particular card you showed us as an example. I went back and counted them and think I found 5.
On which card?
It was one that you used with for an illustration that had a lot of cancels on it.
Oh, yeah, they took their job seriously, and there was a law that said that you had to put a sending postmark and a receiving postmark. I think that law changed in 1910 or something. So in other words, if you mailed a card, you had the stamp postmark, and then when it got to the receiving post office, it had to be stamped as the date of received. So sometimes along the way, it got additional cancels. So that happens. And it messes up the views. You got a beautiful view that's rare, and it's got this black postmark on it.
Through the years that you've been doing this, you've had quite an active partner on with Dr. Dan Freeman.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about Dan?
Yeah, actually, I think he had his 95th birthday in September. I called him in August. He sounded normal, and he said, "I'm looking forward to my 95th birthday." But he wrote 2 books on Pioneer cards, which are cards printed and used before July 1, 1898. And those, actually, he had those cards, those books, he had some left over, you know, from years ago, because we ran an article about him in the Postcard History.
Yeah, we did.
He got a few orders for those books.
That's great news.
Yeah.
Great news. Glad to hear he's celebrating a birthday.
Yeah.
And finally, Hal, when it comes to comments, early on, I forget who it was, somebody, and forgive my short-term memory, but somebody mentioned that they had just returned from Amsterdam on a trip to Europe.
Yes.
And Kyle wrote an article about a museum that was mentioned. It was the Amsterdam Orphanage Museum, I believe.
Yes, he
And
did.
I heard them, yeah.
Kyle contributed that article to Postcard History on September the 22nd, 2022. So if anybody's interested in Kyle's article, go to Postcard History, go to the bottom right corner where the search engines are. Just put in Kyle. That's all you need. Search under his name. All the articles he's done in Postcard History will appear. I think the article was in the second row in the center. So that's a little roadmap or a little recipe for finding Kyle's article.
Thank you. Thank
There
you.
were a couple of other nice compliments to you, Bob. The one question from somebody that asked, "Did you write any books or did you write any books on this topic?" You have to
Yeah,
forgive me. My eyes are.
yeah, I wrote a book on the Lippmann postal card.
They're some
Lippmann,
of the very earliest, right?
well, actually, his is supposedly the granddaddy of the mailing card. He was the first to market cards to others for use. So you would go to him and buy 1,000 cards, pay him money for the cards, and then use the cards and mail them for your printed matter. Now, he did that in 1872.
How about that?
Well, there's misinformation out there, so I was able to research the topic, and I wrote a book in 2019 called "The Lippmann Postal Card: Forerunner from Philadelphia." And by the way, if you look at it, the first two out of the first five cards in the U.S. that were made, two of them were from Philadelphia. So, and Lippmann was from Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is really the postcard capital of the world in terms of beginnings.
I'm sure they'll be glad to hear that.
Oh yeah,
Al, we'll turn it back to you, buddy.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Oh gosh, anybody else have any comments?
Just maybe you bring up that card that I sent you yesterday. Maybe Alan could bring up that card if he's able.
I think he can. He was talked about that earlier. Here it is.
Yeah,
You,
so this card I didn't buy to show, to actually pass down to me, was sent to my great great grandmother in 1894. It's just a lovely European tourist card of a scene in Florence, Italy, that was mailed back to Canada. It took 8 days to get there.
wow,
So it's just really lovely card. So
yeah,
lots happening in Europe on the same score.
yeah. You know what's interesting? If you try to search about private cards, if you wanted to search and ask the question, when was the earliest Italian private postcard? The terminology you get mixes up private cards with government cards. So it's difficult to get the answer that you're looking for. So it's a struggle that to get the final information. And I'm not sure. Do you have any idea when? I have a couple of Italian cards from the 1880s mailed, but they were commercial cards. This was a view card of some sort.
Yeah. The rear side is blank,
Is it okay?
apart from the message that was written on it.
Yeah, I would guess around the 1890s, early 1890s, late 1880s, when the view cards were coming out in the other European countries. Germany, of
Yeah.
course, started real early. They had some cards in 1872.
wow, this is just amazing.
It's a very unusual concept that the artists use with the paintbrushes going through the image at the top.
Didn't he though? Really?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Quite extraordinary.
yeah.
Terrific. Thank you, Kyle, for
Oh, you're
sharing.
most welcome.
Yeah, wonderful. And it's neat that it's your grandmother too. My God.
Yeah.
My great great grandmother.
Okay.
Out there.
Okay.
I
Family.
must correct you there.
That's neat. Any other questions or comments? Well, we also we do thank you, Bob Toal, again and again for this. And we just thank you all for being here and appreciate everyone.
Appreciate it. Thank you.